The little black girl begged the biker while a fleet of trucks blocked every exit along the coastal road. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's incredible story. It's a story about survival, courage, and the unexpected heroes who rise to protect the vulnerable. A little black girl, barely 8 years old, ran down the empty coastal road, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of her breath mixed with the distant rumble of engines that grew louder by the second. Tears streaked her face as she stumbled, barefoot and bruised, desperate to reach the only people she knew could help her. As the sun began to set behind the rugged cliffs of the Pacific coast, the eerie silence was suddenly broken by the screeching sound of tires. She looked behind her and saw them. The silver trucks were coming. No, they were not just coming, they were chasing her. The trucks, blackened and unmarked, seemed to be everywhere, blocking every exit. There was no way out. The little girl's chest tightened in panic as she ran faster, but the weight of fear and exhaustion slowed her down. She knew she couldn't outrun them, but there was one chance left. One last hope. Up ahead, she saw a group of bikers. She had heard of them before, the legendary group of men and women who didn't back down, no matter the odds. She had heard stories of how they stood up for the helpless, how they fought against anyone who thought they could push people around. With no time to waste, the little girl's legs carried her forward as she screamed for help. She was crying now, her voice shaking. "Please, help me," she begged. "They're going to take me, they won't stop." The bikers, who were parked along the side of the road, turned to see the small figure running towards them, and at that moment, they knew something was wrong. One biker, his leather jacket worn and patched with years of service, stepped forward. His name was Jake, and his reputation among his club members was that of a no-nonsense leader who protected his own, no questions asked. He could see the fear in the little girl's eyes as she approached. She had no shoes, no adult with her, and she was running from something, or someone, dangerous. Jake's instincts kicked in. He didn't hesitate. "What's going on, little one?" he asked, his voice low and calm. The girl, barely able to speak between her sobs, managed to choke out a few words. "They're after me. The trucks, they took my brother. Please." Before she could say another word, Jake turned to the other bikers, who were already on high alert. "We're not letting them take her," Jake said firmly. "Get on your bikes. Now." In an instant, the bikers were revving their engines, their motorcycles roaring to life like a thunderstorm. The girl clung to Jake's arm, still crying, as he gently guided her to his bike. With the last rays of daylight fading, the bikers formed a line, ready to protect the girl at all costs. They could hear the trucks closing in. Jake's jaw tightened. He wasn't going to let anyone harm this child. As the engines revved and the convoy began to move, the little girl, still holding on to Jake, knew her life had just changed forever. She was no longer alone in this fight. The bikers would make sure of it. The bikers roared down the coastal road, their engines creating a thunderous sound that echoed across the empty streets. The girl, still clinging to Jake, could barely hold back her tears. She had never felt so scared in her life, yet something about the bikers' presence made her feel just a little safer. They were her last hope. As they sped down the winding road, Jake's mind raced. The trucks were still behind them, their headlights growing brighter with every passing second. He could feel the tension building, and he knew that time was running out. "Keep your head down," Jake instructed the girl, his voice steady despite the growing chaos around them. She nodded, her small body trembling with fear. "Don't worry," Jake added, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure if they would be able to outrun the trucks, but he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. The bikers maintained their formation as they sped through the night, a line of powerful machines cutting through the dark. They were more than just a group of riders. They were a family, and their loyalty ran deep. They weren't going to let anyone mess with one of their own. The girl, who had introduced herself as Aisha, looked up at Jake as they rode. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice shaky. "We're going to make sure you're safe," Jake replied, his focus never leaving the road ahead. The trucks were getting closer now, their ominous presence looming behind them. Aisha looked back, her heart sinking. "They're still following us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. The trucks were closing in fast, but they had a plan. They weren't just going to run forever. Ahead, the rest of the bikers were coordinating their move. "Alpha Team, take the front," Jake ordered through his helmet's comm system. "Bravo Team, flank them from the right. Charlie Team, cover the back. Keep them off our tail." The bikers responded immediately, their voices crackling through the radio. "Roger that." Bear, the club's biggest member, said, his voice deep and gravelly. "Let's show them what we're made of." As the bikers split up, the trucks began to maneuver, trying to surround them. The lead trucks swerved to the left, attempting to block their path, but Jake was ready. He slammed on the gas, the roar of his engine deafening as he swerved around the truck. The rest of the bikers followed, staying in perfect formation, keeping the trucks from gaining any ground. Aisha's heart raced as they sped through the night. She could hear the screech of tires as the trucks tried to keep up. She felt Jake's hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "We're almost there," he said, though his voice had a hard edge to it. Aisha didn't know where there was, but she trusted him. She had no choice. As they approached a sharp curve in the road, Jake signaled to the others. "Brace yourselves," he called out. The bikers leaned into the turn, their tires screeching as they cut the corner, narrowly avoiding the trucks. The fleet of trucks, however, wasn't as nimble. One of them skidded off the road and crashed into a tree. The sound of metal grinding against metal echoed through the night, but Jake didn't slow down. They had no time to waste. They had to get Aisha to safety. "Keep moving," Jake commanded. The trucks were still on their tail, but the bikers had gained some ground. They were heading toward a small town up ahead, and Jake knew that once they reached the city limits, they would have a better chance of losing the trucks in the maze of streets. As they neared the town, the bikers split again, taking different routes to confuse the trucks. Jake and Aisha took a shortcut through a narrow alley, the walls on either side closing in as they sped through. "Are we almost there?" Aisha asked, her voice full of hope. "Just a little longer," Jake said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. The trucks were persistent. He could see the headlights reflecting off the alley walls as the trucks closed in. The bikers were giving it everything they had, but Jake knew they needed a plan to end this chase. They couldn't outrun them forever. The narrow alley opened up to a larger street, and Jake made his move. He veered left, pulling into an abandoned parking lot. The trucks followed, but they were too slow. They had lost their lead. Jake slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop, and the rest of the bikers followed suit. "This is it," Jake said, his voice steady. He looked over at Aisha, who was holding her breath. "Stay close to me." The trucks rolled into the lot moments later, their engines rumbling like a storm on the horizon. Jake stood tall, his eyes locked on the truck drivers who stepped out. They were here for Aisha, but Jake wasn't going to let them have her. The bikers were ready for a fight, but Jake had a different plan. They would do this without violence. It wasn't the way of the club. He raised his hand, signaling the others to stay back. "You want her," Jake said, his voice low and firm. "You'll have to go through us." The truck's drivers paused, sizing up the bikers. They were outnumbered, and they knew it. The tension in the air was thick as Jake and the others stood their ground. The battle for Aisha's safety was far from over, but for the first time that night, she felt like she might actually be safe. The standoff between the bikers and the truck drivers felt like a scene straight out of a movie. The tension in the air was almost palpable as both sides sized each other up, the engines of the bikes rumbling softly as the trucks idled nearby. Jake stood firm, his eyes never leaving the men who had followed them into the parking lot. Behind him, the rest of the bikers waited in silence, their hands hovering over the grips of their bikes, ready for whatever came next. The truck drivers, though armed with the power of their vehicles, knew they were facing something far more dangerous: the loyalty of the Iron Riders. "You're not taking her," Jake said, his voice low but steady. "Not today." A few of the truck drivers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly aware that they were outmatched. The woman in the truck had stayed in the vehicle, her face obscured by the tinted windows. Jake didn't need to know who she was or why she was after Aisha. All he knew was that this wasn't just about a little girl anymore. This was about a promise made years ago, a debt that needed to be repaid. Aisha, still clutching onto Jake's jacket, stood behind him, her eyes wide with fear and curiosity. For the first time since they started running, she felt a glimmer of hope. The bikers weren't just there to protect her. They were there to fight for her, to make sure she stayed safe, no matter the cost. The silence stretched on, thick with uncertainty. It was clear that neither side was willing to back down. Jake took a step forward, his boots making a sharp sound on the cracked pavement. "I don't know what you're after," he continued, his eyes locked on the leader of the trucks, "but you're not getting it here. Not while we're breathing." The truck driver, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, narrowed his eyes. "This doesn't concern you, biker," he growled. "You've got no idea what you're dealing with." Jake's jaw tightened. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with. And I know that you're not taking her. So, you have two choices. You leave, or we make you leave." There was a tense pause, and for a moment, it seemed like the truck drivers were going to make a move. But then, a sudden crackle came over the bikers' radios. It was the voice of one of their own, Bear. "We've got company," Bear said urgently. "More trucks are coming. Looks like reinforcements." Jake's eyes flicked to the horizon, and sure enough, he could see the headlights of several more vehicles approaching. The situation was getting worse by the second. Without hesitating, Jake turned to the rest of the bikers. "Move out," he ordered. "We're not standing here waiting for them to surround us. Let's go." The bikers immediately jumped into action, revving their engines and splitting up. Jake's heart raced as he looked at Aisha. "Hold on," he said, securing her behind him on his bike. As the engines roared to life, the bikers sped out of the parking lot, heading straight for the narrow streets of the town. The trucks followed, but the bikers were faster, more agile, and they knew the roads better. They twisted and turned through the small alleys and back streets, using every shortcut they could find to shake off their pursuers. But the trucks were persistent. They were relentless. Jake pushed his bike harder, weaving in and out of traffic as Aisha clung to him, her face buried in his leather jacket. "We can't outrun them forever," Jake muttered to himself, his mind racing. They had to find a place to hide, a place to regroup and figure out their next move. Suddenly, a glimmer of hope appeared. A large, industrial building loomed ahead, its doors wide open. It was the perfect place to hide. Jake didn't think twice. He made a sharp turn, heading straight for the building. The bikers followed him, their tires screeching as they rounded the corner. The trucks, too large to navigate the sharp turn, were left behind. Jake and the others quickly parked their bikes inside the building, using the shadows to conceal themselves. They killed the engines and sat in silence, listening to the sound of the truck's engines fading into the distance. Aisha, her breathing still heavy, looked up at Jake. "Are we safe now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the area. "For now we are," he said. "But we can't stay here for long. They'll be looking for us." As they waited in the dark, the weight of the situation started to sink in. Aisha was still in danger, and they couldn't let their guard down. Jake knew the stakes were high. They were dealing with people who had no morals, no conscience. But Jake also knew one thing for sure. No one would hurt Aisha while he and his crew were around. They would fight for her, protect her, and make sure she made it out of this alive. The building was silent except for the low hum of the engines still idling outside. Jake stood motionless in the dark, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Aisha was still clinging to him, her body shaking from the fear and exhaustion. She didn't say anything, but he could feel her fear radiating through her. The other bikers were quiet too, each of them watching the entrances, waiting for the trucks to show up. Jake had seen this kind of tension before, but this time it felt different. The stakes were higher. It wasn't just about a chase anymore. It was about keeping Aisha safe, and that meant they needed to act fast. Jake turned to Bear, his second in command, a massive figure who had been with him through countless rides and battles. "We've got to figure out where they're coming from," Jake said, his voice low but urgent. "We can't keep running forever." Bear nodded, his face grim. "I'll check the back door," he said, his voice steady. "Make sure we're not surrounded." Jake turned to the others. "Stay sharp," he ordered. "We move out the second we know where they are." The bikers spread out, checking every corner of the building, their eyes and ears open for any sign of trouble. Jake's mind was racing. He couldn't afford to waste time. The trucks could be back at any moment, and when they came, they'd come with everything they had. Jake stepped outside, looking up at the sky. The night was dark and cold, the wind biting at his skin as he made his way to the alley behind the building. He needed to clear his head, to think. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the distant sound of the truck's engines. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, listening. Then he heard it. A faint sound, the squeal of tires on wet pavement, followed by the rumble of engines. They were coming. The trucks weren't far off. He turned and ran back inside. "They're coming," he called. Out to the group. "Get ready." The bikers moved quickly, pulling their bikes into position, ready to face whatever was coming. Aisha was already on Jake's bike, her small body curled up behind him. She didn't say anything, but Jake could feel her grip tighten on his jacket. He wasn't sure if it was fear or trust, but he didn't care. He was going to get her out of this, no matter what. The sound of the trucks grew louder, closer. Jake's heart raced as he signaled to the others. "Let's move," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The bikers roared to life, their engines growling as they tore down the alley, heading back onto the main road. The trucks were waiting. Jake could see the headlights cutting through the fog, the silver vehicles looming like predators. But Jake wasn't afraid. He knew his team. He knew they could handle anything. The first truck pulled forward, blocking the road ahead, but Jake didn't hesitate. He slammed the throttle forward, the engine roaring as he swerved around the truck, narrowly missing it. Behind him, the other bikers followed, moving like a well-oiled machine. They were in formation now, their bikes cutting through the night as the trucks tried to catch up. Aisha held on tightly, her face pressed against Jake's back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hold on," Jake shouted over the wind. "We're almost there." The road was slick with rain, the tires sliding slightly as they navigated the sharp turns. The trucks were persistent, staying close behind. Jake could feel the heat from the headlights on his back, the pressure building as the trucks tried to close the gap. He couldn't outrun them forever. They needed to find a way to stop them. Up ahead, he saw it, a narrow bridge, just wide enough for the trucks to pass through, but barely. It was their only chance. "We're taking the bridge," Jake shouted. "Stay tight, stay focused." The bikers followed him, their bikes roaring in unison as they closed in on the bridge. The trucks were right behind them now, but they wouldn't be able to make it through in time. The bridge was their escape. As they approached the bridge, Jake hit the gas, his bike lurching forward as he took the first turn. The trucks followed, but they were too large to make the turn at the same speed. Jake grinned as he watched them struggle behind him. This is it, he thought. They were almost home free. But just as they hit the final stretch of the bridge, one of the trucks swerved, trying to block their exit. Jake swerved to avoid it, narrowly missing the truck's front bumper. His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't. Not now. The other bikers followed suit, dodging the truck as it tried to box them in. They weren't just fighting for Aisha anymore. They were fighting for each other. The bridge was a tight squeeze, but it was their only way out. As they crossed to the other side, the trucks were left behind, stuck in the narrow passageway. They had won. But Jake knew this wasn't over. Not yet. They couldn't rest until Aisha was safe. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "We're not done yet." The bikers rode into the night, leaving the trucks behind, but knowing they had a long road ahead. Aisha held on tight, her fears slowly fading away as they disappeared into the darkness. The battle for her safety wasn't over, but for the first time in hours, she felt like she might finally be free. As the last of the trucks disappeared into the distance, Jake felt a momentary sense of relief, but it was fleeting. The battle wasn't over. It was only the beginning. He could hear the wind rushing past his ears, the hum of the engines beneath him, and the sound of Aisha's shallow breathing against his back. She was still holding on to him, her small arms wrapped tightly around his waist. He could feel her fear, but there was also something else in her grip, something like trust. They had made it past the worst, but there was no time to celebrate. They had to keep moving. Jake's mind raced as he navigated the winding road, trying to make sense of everything. Why were they after Aisha? Who were these people, and why had they come for her? And most importantly, who was behind it all? He had 1,000 questions, but there was no time to find the answers right now. They needed to get to a safe place, somewhere they could regroup and figure out their next move. Jake checked his mirrors and saw the other bikers in formation, staying close. They were in this together, and they weren't leaving anyone behind. As they passed through the last stretch of the coastal highway, the road started to open up. The trees cleared, and Jake could see the lights of a small town in the distance. They had made it. It was a small, quiet town, one that seemed like the perfect place to lay low for a while. Jake signaled to the others, and the group began to slow down as they approached the outskirts of the town. He made a sharp turn onto a side road, leading them off the main highway and into the heart of the town. The streetlights flickered above them, casting a soft glow on the empty streets. Jake guided them to a small diner, its neon sign glowing softly in the night. It was the kind of place where nobody asked questions, where you could just blend in. Jake stopped his bike in front of the diner and turned off the engine. He looked back at Aisha, who was still clutching him, her eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. He gave her a reassuring smile, though he wasn't sure if he could convince himself, let alone her. "We're safe for now," he said softly. Aisha didn't say anything, but she nodded, her grip loosening slightly. The bikers parked their bikes around the diner, forming a protective circle around the small building. It was clear they weren't going anywhere until Aisha was out of danger. Jake motioned for the rest of the group to stay outside, while he went inside to talk to the diner's owner. The old man behind the counter looked up as Jake entered, his eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of the leather-clad bikers. Jake had a feeling that the man had seen his share of trouble in the past. "What can I do for you?" the man asked, his voice low and gruff. "We need a place to lay low for a bit," Jake said, his tone calm but firm. "We're not causing any trouble, just passing through." The man studied him for a moment, his gaze shifting to the window where the bikes were parked. He could see the other bikers standing guard outside. After a long moment, he nodded. "You're welcome to stay," he said, "but keep it quiet. This is a small town, and we don't want any attention." Jake gave a short nod of thanks and went back outside. He motioned for Aisha to follow him, and they made their way into the diner. Aisha looked around nervously, her eyes scanning the empty booths. Jake led her to a small corner booth, away from the windows. As they sat down, the waitress came over, her eyes curious but polite. She didn't ask any questions. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice soft. Jake glanced at Aisha, who looked up at him with uncertain eyes. "Just some coffee for now," he said, offering a small smile. As the waitress left, Jake leaned back in his seat and looked at Aisha. "We're safe for now," he repeated, though his voice was more to reassure himself than her. Aisha didn't answer, but she gave him a faint smile in return. It was the first sign of relief he had seen from her since this whole thing began. Outside, the other bikers kept watch, their eyes scanning every car that passed. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. Jake knew that the moment they thought they were safe, that was when the real danger would come. The waitress returned with their coffee, placing the cups on the table. Jake thanked her quietly, and she left them alone. The silence between him and Aisha was comfortable, but it was also heavy. Neither of them spoke, but the weight of the situation hung in the air. Jake's mind was still racing. How long could they stay here? How long before the trucks found them again? There was no way to know for sure, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to stop until Aisha was safe. They had made it this far, and he wasn't going to let her down now. Aisha took a sip of her coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she held the cup. Jake watched her for a moment, then stood up. "I'll be back in a minute," he said. Aisha nodded, her gaze still distant. Jake made his way to the door, his eyes scanning the street as he stepped outside. The bikers were still standing guard, their faces grim. "Anything?" Jake asked quietly. "Nothing yet," Bear replied. "But we're not taking any chances." Jake nodded. The next few hours would determine whether they made it out of this safely. He only hoped they had enough time to figure out their next move before the trucks found them again. The diner was quiet, the soft hum of the neon lights the only sound breaking the stillness. Jake sat at the small booth, his eyes on Aisha, who was slowly sipping her coffee, her hands still trembling slightly. He could tell she was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but at least for now, she was safe. That was all that mattered. The other bikers were still on high alert, watching the entrance and the street outside. No one was taking any chances. After the close call on the bridge, Jake knew the danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Jake leaned back in the booth, his mind began to race again. He needed to find out more about these people who were after Aisha. Who were they, and what did they want? And why had they come after her so violently? He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger at play here, something he hadn't yet understood. The questions gnawed at him, but for now, They had to wait. His priority was Aisha. She had been through enough. She needed answers, but not now. Jake glanced over at her again. She wasn't looking at him now, her eyes lost in thought. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Aisha blinked, as if coming out of a daze. She nodded, her lips trembling. "I'm fine," she said, but there was something in her voice that made Jake doubt it. She wasn't fine. No one could be after everything she had been through. But he wasn't going to push her. Not now. She had been through enough, and this wasn't the time to force her to talk. They needed a plan, and Jake wasn't going to rest until he had one. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Bear. "We've got company," the message read. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "How many?" he typed back quickly. "3 trucks," Bear replied. "They're parked up the street. We're not sure if they're here for us or not, but we're not taking any chances." Jake cursed under his breath. "Stay on them," he typed. "We'll move out in 5. He put the phone down and looked at Aisha, who was still sitting quietly. "We need to go," he said, standing up and pulling on his jacket. Aisha looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "Are they here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. "It's time to move. Stay close to me." The two of them stood up, Jake guiding Aisha toward the door. The other bikers were already outside, preparing to leave, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of trouble. Jake led Aisha to his bike, helping her onto it before climbing on behind her. The bikes roared to life, the sound cutting through the stillness of the night. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Jake glanced over his shoulder. The trucks were still parked up the street, their headlights shining brightly in the distance. He knew they couldn't outrun them forever. They needed to get out of town and fast. The group of bikers moved in formation, their engines growling as they sped down the road. Jake stayed close to Aisha, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, his senses on high alert. The rest of the bikers stayed tight, their bikes weaving in and out of traffic, blocking any potential pursuit. The trucks were following, but they were slow, unable to keep up with the nimble bikers. Still, Jake knew it wouldn't take long for them to regroup and try again. He needed to get them somewhere safe. He turned onto a side street, leading them through a series of narrow alleys, trying to shake the trucks. The sound of the engines behind them grew louder, but Jake pushed harder, taking the curves at breakneck speeds. He could hear Aisha's breathing, still shallow, but steadier now. She was holding on, her small body pressing against his, but he could tell the fear hadn't completely left her. "We're almost there," Jake shouted over the wind, though he wasn't sure where there was. He just had to keep moving. Ahead, he saw it, a small warehouse on the edge of town, its door wide open. It was their best chance to lose the trucks. He signaled to the others to follow him, and they sped toward the warehouse. The trucks were still behind them, but they were falling further back. As they neared the entrance, Jake could see the other bikers already, lining up in front of the door, ready to make a stand. He gunned the engine and pulled the bike into the warehouse, the others following him in. The door slammed shut behind them, and they killed their engines, the silence settling over them like a heavy fog. They were safe, at least for now. Jake looked at Aisha, her eyes wide, her face pale from fear and exhaustion. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure how. The rest of the bikers gathered around, ready to make a plan. The trucks were still out there, and Jake knew they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. But for the first time since this nightmare started, he felt like they had a chance. They had each other, and they weren't going down without a fight. The air inside the warehouse was thick with tension. The bikers sat in a circle, the sound of their engines now silent, but their minds racing. Jake stood at the center, his hands clenched into fists as he looked at each of them. They were all there, ready for whatever came next, but Jake knew that they weren't out of danger yet. Aisha was sitting in the corner, her small form curled into herself. She was quiet now, her fear still hanging in the air. Jake's heart ached for her. She had been through so much already, but now was the time to put the plan into action. He couldn't afford to fail her. "All right," Jake said, breaking the silence. "We've got a limited window before those trucks regroup. We need to move fast." Bear, his loyal second-in-command, nodded. "I'll take the front," he said, his voice low and steady. "We'll need to block off any way out." Jake looked over at the others. "We've got to get her out of here. We need to get her somewhere safe, somewhere they can't find her." What about the trucks? One of the bikers asked. We can't outrun them forever. Jake clenched his jaw. We won't have to outrun them. We'll lose them in the city. He turned back to Aisha, who had barely moved. She was still sitting, her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes vacant. Aisha, Jake said softly, moving towards her. She looked up at him, her face pale and tired, but there was something different in her eyes now. The fear was still there, but so was something else, hope. We're going to get you to safety, Jake said, crouching down beside her. Aisha didn't say anything at first. She just nodded, her hands trembling. Jake gently put his hand on her shoulder. It's going to be okay, he said, though even he wasn't entirely sure. The sound of footsteps broke the moment, and the bikers moved quickly, preparing for the next step. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would split up, draw the trucks into the city, and then lose them in the maze of streets. The rest of the group would create a distraction, while Jake and Aisha made their way to a safe house on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was the only option they had. The bikers began to move, their bikes roaring back to life as they prepared to face whatever came next. Jake and Aisha made their way to the door, but just as they were about to leave, Bear stopped them. Jake, wait, he said, his voice urgent. I've been hearing things. I think someone's been tracking us. Jake's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Bear's eyes were narrowed, his voice low. I think someone tipped them off. The trucks knew exactly where we were going. Jake's mind raced. If someone was tracking them, they couldn't afford to waste any time. We move now, he said, his voice sharp. Without another word, he led Aisha out into the night, the other bikers following close behind. The streets of the city were quiet, almost too quiet. Jake's senses were on high alert as they moved through the darkened roads, the low rumble of the bikes the only sound breaking the silence. As they reached the main street, Jake looked around. There was no sign of the trucks yet, but he knew they couldn't be far behind. The plan was in motion. They had to stick to the streets, make it through the intersections, and keep moving. Jake's heart was pounding as they navigated through the city's narrow streets. Aisha was still holding on to him, her grip tight. He could feel her trembling against his back. We're almost there, he said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. They needed to get to the safe house, but the trucks were closing in. He could feel it. The bikers were holding their positions, moving with purpose, but the trucks were persistent. They were staying just behind them, waiting for an opening. We need a distraction, Jake muttered to himself. He pulled a sharp turn, heading toward a dead-end alley that led to the safe house. The others followed, but the trucks weren't as quick to adjust. The alley was tight, and Jake knew they would have to make a stand. As they reached the end of the alley, Jake glanced over his shoulder. The trucks were still following, but they had lost ground. He slammed the brakes on his bike and turned to Aisha. Get off, he said, his voice urgent. Now. Aisha looked at him, confusion in her eyes. What do you mean? She asked, her voice shaky. Go, Jake shouted. Now? Get to the safe house. I'll cover you. Aisha hesitated for just a moment before scrambling off the bike, her feet hitting the ground hard. She ran toward the entrance of the safe house, but Jake wasn't focused on her anymore. He turned to face the trucks, his heart pounding in his chest. They had made it this far. He wasn't going to let them take Aisha now. The trucks pulled into the alley, blocking the only way out. Jake's fists clenched, his eyes narrowing. He was ready. They weren't getting past him. He wasn't going to let them. Aisha had made it inside, and now it was his turn to make sure she stayed safe. The bikers circled around him, ready to fight. This was it. The final stand. And Jake wasn't going to back down. The trucks were blocking the alley, their engines roaring like beasts ready to strike. Jake stood his ground, his leather jacket catching the dim light of the street lamp, a stark contrast to the shadowy figures approaching him. The air was thick with tension, every biker on high alert, ready for whatever came next. Jake glanced over his shoulder at the safe house entrance. Aisha was inside, safe for now, but the feeling of dread still clung to him. The trucks weren't just after Aisha. They were here for something bigger, something Jake couldn't yet understand. He had to make sure they didn't get to her. The truck's headlights blazed brighter as they closed in, and Jake could hear the screech of tires as the vehicles came to a halt. His fingers tightened around the grips of his bike, and his heart began to race. This was the moment he had been dreading. They had no more time to run. It was time to stand and fight. The truck doors opened with a metallic creak, and out stepped the men Jake had been avoiding for the past few days. They were rough-looking, their faces cold and hard, their eyes locked on Jake. The leader of the group, the same man with the scar on his cheek, took a step forward, his boots echoing in the silence. "You think you can just take her and run?" the man growled, his voice low and menacing. Jake didn't flinch. "I'm not running anywhere," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "This ends now." The scarred man smirked, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "You think you can stop us? You're outnumbered, biker. We'll take her, and there's nothing you can do about it." Jake could feel the tension in the air, the way the others were waiting for his move. But he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of an easy fight. He had something the truck drivers didn't: unity. The bikers were his family, and they fought for each other. "I don't think you understand," Jake said, his voice cold. "You don't mess with us. Not now, not ever." The man lunged at Jake, his fists swinging with deadly force. But Jake was ready. He ducked and dodged the punch, countering with a sharp blow to the man's stomach. The force of the hit sent the man stumbling backward, but he quickly regained his balance. "You're going to regret this," the man hissed, his eyes burning with rage. Jake didn't give him a chance to recover. He moved quickly, grabbing the man by the collar and slamming him into the side of one of the trucks. The truck shuddered under the impact, and Jake felt the man's grip loosen as he gasped for air. But the fight was far from over. The rest of the truck drivers were closing in, their hands reaching for weapons, but the bikers weren't backing down. Bear, the giant of the group, stepped forward, his muscles flexing as he moved toward the others. "You mess with one of us," Bear growled, "and you mess with all of us." The bikers formed a protective circle around Jake, each of them ready for battle. The truck's drivers hesitated for a moment, clearly realizing that they were outmatched. But their hesitation was short-lived. With a roar, one of the men pulled out a gun, aiming it straight at Jake. "Move, and I'll shoot," the man threatened, his voice shaking with anger. But Jake didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on the man's trembling hand. "You're not going to shoot," Jake said, his voice steady and sure. "Because if you do, you'll have to deal with all of us." The man's finger hovered over the trigger, his eyes flicking nervously between Jake and the rest of the bikers. The air was thick with tension, but Jake knew that if they backed down now, Aisha would be in even more danger. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, the only sounds the distant rumble of engines and the harsh breathing of the men. But just as Jake thought the situation would escalate into something worse, there was a sudden crash from behind. One of the bikers, Shadow, had broken through the side alley and charged at the remaining truck drivers. The sound of his bike revving startled the men, and in that moment, they lost their focus. The bikers seized the opportunity. They moved in fast, using their sheer numbers and speed to overpower the truck drivers. Bear tackled one of the men to the ground, while Shadow swerved around to cut off another. Jake knocked the gun out of the leader's hand, sending it skidding across the pavement. With one last effort, Jake punched the man square in the jaw, sending him to the ground. The truck drivers, now clearly beaten, scrambled to their feet and rushed to their trucks. "This isn't over," the scarred man growled, his voice dripping with venom. But Jake was already moving, his eyes focused on the safe house. "Get out of here," Jake called to his crew. "We're done here." The bikers quickly mounted their bikes and revved the engines, the sound filling the alley as they sped off toward the safe house. Jake looked back one last time, watching the trucks disappear into the distance. They had won this round, but he knew they couldn't let their guard down. Not yet. Aisha was safe, for now. But the battle was far from over. The night air was cold as Jake and the bikers rode in silence, the only sound the hum of their engines and the occasional crackle of the comm system. Aisha was still with him, her body pressed against his back, but the tension between them was palpable. Jake could feel her fear, and though she had not spoken a word, her presence was a constant reminder of the danger they were all still in. They had fought hard to get here, but Jake knew the battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. They had won the fight against the truck drivers, but it didn't take long for Jake to realize that something bigger was at play. The man with the scar on his face, the one who had been in charge of the trucks, hadn't just been a thug looking to intimidate them. There was something far more dangerous behind this, and Jake could sense it. As they reached the outskirts of the town, Jake took a sharp turn, leading the group down a narrow, deserted street. The headlights of the trucks were still far behind, but he wasn't taking any chances. He had no idea who was behind this pursuit, but he wasn't about to let them take Aisha or the others. The safe house was just ahead, a small, inconspicuous house at the end of a quiet road. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Jake motioned for the others to follow as they rode up the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath their tires. He parked his bike next to the others and killed the engine. Aisha slid off the back of his bike, her legs unsteady as she stepped onto the ground. Jake helped steady her, his hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, her eyes still filled with fear, but there was something else there too. Gratitude. She didn't say anything, but Jake could see it in the way she held herself, in the way her eyes softened when she looked at him. "We're safe for now," Jake said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. They had come this far, but he knew the danger wasn't over. They had to stay vigilant. The others parked their bikes and dismounted, their faces grim. Bear, the largest of the group, stepped forward. "We need to move fast," he said. "We don't know how much time we have before they come back for us." Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. "Let's get inside," he said. The group moved quickly, entering the small house and securing the doors behind them. Inside, it was quiet, almost too quiet. Aisha went to one of the chairs in the corner and sat down, her hands still trembling. Jake glanced at her for a moment before turning to the others. "We need answers," he said, his voice low. "Who's behind this? Why are they after her?" Bear, always the strategist, nodded. "We need to figure out who these people are. We can't keep running." Jake paced the room, his mind racing. He had 1,000 questions, but the most pressing one was clear. Who was behind the attack on Aisha? Who was pulling the strings? And why had they targeted her? He looked back at Aisha, who had her head down, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Aisha," he said gently. She looked up at him, her eyes still wide with fear, but now there was something else in them. A glimmer of hope. "Do you know who's after you? Do you know why they're doing this?" Aisha hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. She opened her mouth to speak, but then closed it again. Jake could see the struggle in her eyes. She wanted to tell him, but the words weren't coming. "It's okay," Jake said softly. "You don't have to tell me now. We'll figure it out." Aisha nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Jake turned to the others. "We need to find out who's behind this. But we also need to stay low for now. They'll be looking for us." The bikers nodded in agreement. They had faced danger before, but this felt different. It was more than just a gang trying to chase them down. There was something much bigger at play, and Jake wasn't sure if they could handle it. "We stay here for the night," Jake said. "Tomorrow, we figure out our next move." Bear and the others settled into the small house, keeping watch while the rest of the group tried to get some rest. Jake took the first watch, sitting near the window, his eyes scanning the street outside. The night was calm, but Jake knew that calm didn't mean safe. The trucks could come back at any moment. Aisha sat quietly in the corner, her body still tense, but she was starting to relax, her breathing evening out. Jake's eyes lingered on her for a moment, his heart heavy. She had been through so much, but they still had a long way to go before she was truly safe. The night stretched on, the hours crawling by, but finally, just as dawn began to break, there was a shift in the air, a sound in the distance, the unmistakable rumble of engines. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He stood up, his body tense, as he motioned for the others to wake up. "They're coming," he said, his voice low but urgent. The bikers quickly got to their feet, their faces hardening as they prepared for what was to come. The calm was over. It was time to fight again. This time, they had to end it for good. The sound of engines grew louder as the first light of dawn broke across the horizon. Jake stood by the window, his eyes narrowing as he listened to the approaching vehicles. The trucks were back. It was only a matter of time before they arrived at the safe house. Jake's mind raced as he moved toward the door, signaling for the others to prepare. The calm they had experienced earlier was over. This was it. The moment they had been waiting for, or rather, the moment they had been dreading. The trucks were no longer just a threat. They were a full-on assault. He could feel the adrenaline beginning to surge through him, his muscles tensing as he prepared for the fight. The bikers were ready, standing by their bikes, their faces hard with determination. They had been through battles before, but this time felt different. This wasn't just about getting Aisha to safety anymore. This was about putting an end to this pursuit once and for all. Jake turned to Bear, who was already mounted on his bike, ready to go. "We stick to the plan," Jake said, his voice firm. "We draw them into the city and lose them in the streets. We don't stop until we know they're gone." Bear nodded, his eyes dark with resolve. "Got it," he said simply. Jake turned to Aisha, who was sitting quietly in the corner, her eyes wide but calm. She had been through so much, and Jake knew she was afraid, but he also knew she was strong. Stronger than most people gave her credit for. "You ready?" Jake asked softly. Aisha nodded, her face set with determination. "I'm ready," she said, though her voice trembled just slightly. Jake offered her a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. There was no time for hesitation now. He stepped outside, his boots heavy against the concrete floor, and made his way to his bike. The rest of the crew followed, their engines roaring to life as they readied themselves for the next phase of the plan. They weren't running anymore. This was it. The trucks were getting closer. Jake could hear the rumble of their engines in the distance, but he didn't flinch. They had been preparing for this moment for days, and now they were ready to fight back. He mounted his bike, revved the engine, and motioned for the others to follow. The group took off down the street, their bikes weaving through the early morning traffic as they headed toward the heart of the city. The trucks followed, their headlights still shining bright as they gained on the bikers. Jake could feel the pressure building in his chest. They had to lose them, and they had to do it fast. He glanced at Bear, who was riding beside him. "We take the next left," Jake said, his voice steady but urgent. Bear nodded, and without a word, they both made the turn. The rest of the bikers followed, cutting through the narrow streets of the city with precision and speed. Jake's mind was racing as he focused on the road ahead. He could see the trucks behind them, but they were struggling to keep up. The bikers were fast, too fast. They had the advantage of agility, and they used it to their full advantage. As they reached a wide intersection, Jake signaled to the others to split up. The trucks were too large to maneuver through the narrow streets, but the bikers had no problem weaving in and out of traffic. They knew the streets like the back of their hands. The trucks were getting closer, but the bikers were pulling away. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he took another sharp turn, leading the group toward a narrow alleyway. The trucks tried to follow, but they were too slow, unable to make the sharp turn in time. Jake glanced behind him, watching as the trucks were left behind, blocked by traffic. It was working. They were losing them. But Jake knew they couldn't keep this up forever. They had to make a final push. As they reached the next street, Jake saw it. A bridge. The perfect place to make their stand. He signaled to the others to follow, and they took off toward the bridge, their bikes roaring like thunder. The trucks were still in pursuit, but they were too far behind. Jake grinned as he saw the entrance to the bridge ahead. They were almost there. As they reached the bridge, Jake's mind raced with the plan. The trucks couldn't get through the narrow passage. The bikers would be safe on the other side. They just had to make it across. Jake pushed his bike harder, the engine screaming beneath him as he raced toward the bridge. The other bikers followed, their bikes close behind. As they reached the entrance, Jake glanced behind him. The trucks were too far behind. They had made it. For now, they were safe. The bikers roared across the bridge, the sound of their engines echoing through the empty streets. As they crossed to the other side, Jake glanced over at Aisha, who was clinging to him tightly. He could feel the relief in her grip. She was safe for now, but Jake knew this wasn't over. They had made it through the first wave, but there was still so much more to come. The trucks were still out there, and they would stop at nothing to find them. Jake's eyes narrowed as he looked ahead. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was ready for whatever came next. For Aisha's sake, he had to be. "We keep moving," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "We don't stop until we know we're safe." The bikers nodded in agreement, their engines roaring back to life as they rode off into the night. The fight wasn't over, but Jake was determined to win. For Aisha, and for the family they had become. The road stretched out ahead, the early morning mist beginning to lift as the bikers continued to ride. The weight of the night's events still hung heavy in the air. Jake's mind was racing with thoughts of what came next. They had made it across the bridge, and for a moment, it seemed like they were free. But he knew better than to think they were out of danger. The trucks could be back at any moment, and they wouldn't stop until they found Aisha. As they rode through the winding streets, Jake stole a quick glance at her. She was still holding on to him tightly, her face pressed against his back, but there was a certain calmness to her now. Maybe it was the distance between them and the trucks, or maybe it was the sense of safety the bikers had given her. Either way, Jake felt a small sense of relief. For now, they were safe. He could feel the tension in the air begin to loosen, but his instincts told him not to let his guard down. He could still hear the distant hum of the trucks behind them, faint but persistent. It wasn't over yet. The other bikers were riding close, their bikes moving in perfect sync. They were a family, and they weren't about to leave anyone behind. Jake's eyes flicked to Bear, who was riding beside him. Bear's expression was grim, his face set in determination. "We need to keep moving," Jake said, his voice steady. "We can't stop until we're sure they're not following." Bear nodded, his eyes scanning the road ahead. The others were just as focused, their eyes darting back and forth, watching for any signs of danger. Aisha had barely spoken, but Jake knew she was still processing everything. She had been through so much, more than any child should ever have to experience. But she was still here, still alive. That was something. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice soft, though he didn't expect much of a response. Aisha didn't answer at first, her grip on him tightening slightly. Then, finally, she whispered, "I'm scared." Jake's heart ached for her, but he couldn't let her see how much this was affecting him. "I know," he said quietly, "but we're getting through this. You're safe now." She didn't respond, but Jake could feel her holding on, not just physically, but emotionally. She was stronger than she realized. As they rode through the empty streets, the early morning fog began to clear, revealing the quiet town ahead. Jake's mind was already running through the next steps. He had to find out who was behind all of this, why they were after Aisha, and most importantly, how to keep her safe. They had to be careful. Whoever they were dealing with was relentless. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden burst of static over the comms. He immediately snapped to attention. "Jake, we've got a problem." Bear's voice crackled through the radio. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" "We're being followed," Bear replied, his tone sharp. "A couple of cars are coming up fast from behind." Jake cursed under his breath. He had hoped they had lost the trucks, but it seemed they were still being hunted. "How many?" Jake asked, his voice calm but urgent. "2, maybe 3, Bear said. "But they're gaining on us. We need to make a move." Jake's mind raced. "We'll take the next exit," he said quickly. "Head for the alley behind the diner." Everyone split up. "We'll meet up after." "Got it," Bear responded. Jake quickly signaled to the others, and the bikers veered off the main road, heading for a narrow exit that led to a series of backstreets. The roar of their engines filled the air, but Jake could hear the distant rumble of the cars behind them. They were getting closer. The tension in the group was palpable. Jake's eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, his mind focused on the task at hand. They had to stay ahead of these cars, no matter what. As they made the turn into the alley, Jake glanced in the rearview mirror. The cars were still coming, their headlights cutting through the darkness like predators closing in on their prey. But Jake wasn't about to let that happen. They had been in worse situations before, and they had always come out on top. He just had to keep his focus. "Stay sharp," Jake called out over the comms. "We're almost there." The bikers stayed close, weaving through the narrow alleyways with precision. They had to make it to the other side of the town before the cars caught up. As they rounded the final corner, Jake spotted the diner up ahead, its neon sign flickering in the dim light. He pushed the throttle harder, urging his bike forward. They were almost there. But just as they reached the entrance to the diner's parking lot, Jake saw the headlights of the cars reflecting off the wet pavement. The cars were closing in fast. Without thinking, Jake slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just short of the diner's entrance. The rest of the bikers followed, quickly taking cover behind the nearby dumpster. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest as he watched the cars pull into the parking lot. They had to act fast. He motioned to Bear, who was already preparing for a confrontation. "We make our stand here," Jake said, his voice steady. "We fight until we know they're not coming after us again." The rest of the bikers nodded, ready for whatever came next. They had made it this far, and they weren't going to stop now. The tension in the air was thick as the headlights of the approaching cars drew closer to the diner. Jake's hand tightened around the grip of his bike, the familiar sound of the engine now a distant memory. The world around him felt strangely quiet, as if time had slowed, his senses heightened, every move calculated. The other bikers were stationed around the alley, ready for a fight, but they knew better than to charge in headfirst without a plan. The cars were moving steadily into the parking lot, their engines rumbling like predators stalking their prey. Jake's mind raced. They were close, too close. They couldn't afford a direct confrontation in such a tight space. Not yet. He glanced at Bear, who gave a subtle nod, signaling that he was ready. Without taking his eyes off the approaching vehicles, Jake signaled to the others. "Wait for it," he murmured, barely audible. The bikers held their position, crouched low behind dumpsters and crates, every one of them knowing that their chances depended on their ability to strike when the time was right. The cars pulled into the lot with slow, deliberate movements. It wasn't until the first car was nearly parallel to the alley where Jake and the others were hiding that he made his move. With a quick twist of the throttle, Jake shot out from behind cover, his bike roaring to life. The others followed suit, engines revving in unison, as they tore into the parking lot, cutting off any escape route. The vehicles jerked to a halt as the bikers surrounded them, a wall of leather and chrome closing in. "Get out!" Jake yelled, his voice sharp, as the cars came to a screeching stop. The truck drivers inside the vehicles hesitated for a moment, clearly shocked by the sudden appearance of the bikers, but the hesitation didn't last long. The door of the first truck flung open, and one of the men stepped out, hand immediately going for a weapon. Jake saw the movement and reacted in an instant. He swerved his bike to the side, skidding to a stop right in front of the man, blocking his path. "You don't want to do this," Jake said, his voice low and calm, his eyes never leaving the man's face. The man sneered, clearly underestimating the bikers. "You think you can just get in our way?" he growled, taking a step forward. Jake didn't flinch. "I don't think. I know." The standoff was only broken by the sound of a second man getting out of the other truck, his eyes darting nervously between Jake and his crew. Without a word, Jake signaled to the others. Bear, who was closest, didn't hesitate. He charged forward, using his bulk to his advantage, pushing the second man back into the truck with a swift motion. The man stumbled but quickly regained his footing, reaching for a knife at his side. "Stay down," Bear warned, his voice booming. The man hesitated, looking around at the bikers who were now closing in on him from every angle. "This doesn't have to get worse," Bear added, his posture ready to strike if needed. The man's eyes darted to the trucks, then back to the bikers, weighing his options. Jake watched it all unfold, his body tense, but his mind clear. He wasn't going to let Aisha's safety slip away just because of a few threats. The leader of the truck crew, the one with the scar, still hadn't made a move. He stood across the lot, watching the scene unfold, his eyes calculating. "I'm done running," Jake said, his voice cutting through the air. "So is this. You have two choices. You can leave now, or we'll make sure you do." The scarred man's lip curled into a half-smile. "You really think you can just stop us? You've no idea who you're messing with." Jake's grip on his bike tightened, his body still. "I don't need to know who you are. I just need to know that you're leaving. And you will." For a moment, neither side moved, the tension thick enough to choke. The sound of footsteps echoed in the background as one of the truck drivers tried to sneak up on Bear, but the bikers were too fast. Jake saw the movement and shouted, "Watch out." Bear turned just in time to catch the man's wrist, twisting it violently until the man cried out and dropped the knife. "Last warning," Bear growled, letting the man go but staying close, ready for a fight. The leader, now visibly furious, clenched his fists, clearly realizing the situation was slipping out of his control. "You think we're going to let this go?" he spat. Jake slowly lowered his bike's kickstand, the message clear. "You won't get a chance to try again," he said coldly. The scarred man hesitated, his gaze shifting between Jake, Bear, and the others. Finally, after a long, tense moment, he spoke. "We're done here," he said through gritted teeth, though it was clear he wasn't giving up just yet. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." With that, the man waved his hand at the others, signaling them to retreat. Reluctantly, the truck drivers climbed back into their vehicles, the engines sputtering to life once more. They reversed slowly, giving the bikers one last look before pulling away. As the trucks disappeared into the distance, Jake let out a long breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "Is it over?" Aisha asked quietly, her voice shaky as she stepped toward Jake. Jake turned to her, offering a reassuring smile, though he knew the danger was far from finished. "It's over for now," he said, But even he knew that the fight wasn't truly over. The trucks would be back. And next time, they would be ready. The dust from the retreating trucks settled slowly, leaving the air thick with the remnants of tension. Jake stood still for a moment, watching the road stretch out before them. The silence was deafening after the chaos, and as the noise of the trucks faded into the distance, he let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Aisha stood beside him, her small body still trembling, but her eyes were more focused now. They had made it through yet another fight, but Jake knew this wasn't the end. He glanced over at Bear, who was still scanning the area, his posture rigid as if waiting for the next threat to emerge. But for now, they were safe. At least, that's what Jake kept telling himself. He turned to Aisha, offering a soft smile, though his heart was still heavy. "It's over for now," he said, though even he wasn't convinced by his own words. Aisha looked up at him, her face pale but determined. "You're not going to let them hurt me, right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's heart clenched. He kneeled down in front of her, looking her in the eye. "I swear to you, Aisha," he said, his voice steady. "No one is going to hurt you while I'm still standing." She nodded, her small hands trembling as she wiped away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. Jake could see the fear still in her eyes, but there was also something else, something that wasn't there when they first met. Trust. She was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could get through this together. The sound of bikes revving behind him broke the moment, and Jake turned to see the rest of the crew gathering around. They had all come through this together, and now it was time to move forward. Jake stood, his face hardening with determination. "Let's move out," he said, his voice strong. Bear nodded, giving a quick signal to the others. Without a word, the group mounted their bikes and began to move, weaving through the streets with practiced precision. They were a family now, bound by more than just loyalty. They were bound by the fight to keep each other safe, no matter the cost. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the quiet town. For a moment, it almost felt like everything was going to be okay. But Jake knew better than to trust the calm. They had made it through the worst, but they weren't done yet. The trucks could be back at any moment, and Jake wasn't about to let his guard down. They needed to keep moving, stay one step ahead. The safe house was no longer safe. It was time to find a new place to lay low, to regroup, and to figure out what their next move would be. Aisha sat behind him, still holding on tight, but there was something in her grip. Now, it wasn't just fear, it was trust. They had come so far, and Jake wasn't going to let her down. Not now, not ever. As they rode through the town, the streets starting to wake up, Jake couldn't help but think about the road ahead. They had no idea who was after Aisha, or why, but Jake wasn't going to stop until he found out. And when he did, he was going to make sure they paid. But for now, he had to focus on keeping Aisha safe, keeping his family safe. They had already fought too hard to let anything tear them apart. They reached the edge of town, the road ahead now open and clear. Jake glanced back at Aisha, her face still pale, but her eyes a little less fearful. "We're almost there," he said softly, though he knew it wasn't over yet. She nodded, though she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She trusted him, and that was enough. The group of bikers continued to ride, their engines roaring in unison, the sound of their freedom filling the morning air. They were together, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake felt a spark of hope. They were going to get through this. They had to, because Aisha's safety wasn't just a mission. It was a promise, and Jake always kept his promises. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake was ready. Ready to fight, ready to protect, and ready to do whatever it took to make sure that Aisha, and everyone he cared about, made it through to the other side. He revved his engine, the rumble of his bike like a declaration. This was far from over. But they were still standing. And as long as they were, they would fight. For Aisha, for the family, and for the future they were going to build, one road at a time.